This is Section 2 of the Civil Rights Movement notes. Alright, so we left off with the Montgomery bus boycott. We're going to start today with more nonviolent protests like that first one we talked about. Sit-ins. February 1st, 1960, 4 African-American college students ordered donuts and coffee at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. As expected, the white waitress refused to serve them. We talked about this yesterday, or in section 1 of our notes, that many restaurants and places like a Woolworth's, which is kind of like, I don't know what to even compare it to today. Maybe like a picture like maybe like Walgreens, but there's also like a deli counter or a soda fountain in it. Kind of similar to that. But they could be segregated. They could have, a section for African-American customers, or they could just not serve African-American customers at all in the South. So, waitress refused to serve them. To protest their lack of service, the students sat at the lunch counter all day long until it closed. So that top picture on the left is the Greensboro sit-in that I was referring to. The picture next to that on the right, those are students participating in a sit-in in Jackson, Mississippi. There's a YouTube video that I'm going to add to your Google Classroom that has a reenactment of this from the movie The Butler, if any of you have seen that. So we'll kind of get to see what that one was like. They were harassed. You can kind of tell from the picture, but when I show you the reenactment, you'll really understand what that was like. So word of the sit-in spreads, and it leads to more sit-ins like the one in Jackson across the country, and different forms of protests like that, like read-ins at white-only libraries. The sit-ins marked the birth of a new militancy among young African Americans. To build on the momentum achieved in the sit-ins, 175 students from 30 different states met at Shaw University to hear James Lawson speak. In the video that we watched from some of the scenes from The Butler, you'll get to see James Lawson, and he kind of explains his nonviolent approach and the religious background, spiritual background that kind of goes along with that. At this meeting, Ella Baker, a veteran of the struggle for civil rights and the organizer of the meeting, as a member of the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, helped young activists establish their own committee called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Sometimes you will hear it called SNCC, so all those are the same thing. Interstate transportation was an important battleground for civil rights because interstate transportation was under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So if a bus goes between more than one state, or any kind of transportation like trains, which we talked about in the fall, then it is obviously a federal jurisdiction because it includes more than one state. It can't just be a state, regulated industry. So in the spring of 1961, CORE organized a freedom ride through southern states. Riders set off in 2 separate buses from D.C., bound for New Orleans. You can see the map in the bottom right corner of the slide of where they all were going to go and the stops they were going to make along the way, and defy segregation the entire time they were doing it, whether it be on the buses just in general or in the waiting rooms or wherever they stopped. In Anniston, Alabama, or right outside of it rather, the trip took a dangerous turn, and that picture in the top right corner of the slide is a real picture from the attack of the Freedom Bus outside of Anniston by white citizens from Anniston and also members of the Ku Klux Klan. The buses were attacked by pro-segregationists, like I said, and firebombed, so kind of homemade Molotov cocktail-like bombs. They broke the windows out of the buses, kind of forced them to a stop, and then threw these homemade bombs inside. A lot of people got hurt. Here's one of the riders that got hurt. So the riders of these freedom buses were black and white. That was the point. It was an integrated bus. It was an integrated movement. And footage of this and videos of this and different pictures like this one made its way around the country and prodded the new president, which we'll talk about him getting elected in a couple of weeks. I know I kind of go out of order. But anyway, JFK to intervene yet again. He had helped Martin Luther King previously get released from a Georgia prison while he was a candidate. King had been sentenced to 6 months for a traffic violation. Kennedy worked with Mississippi leaders to create a deal in which police and state troopers would protect the rioters. Kennedy agreed not to intervene for arrests in which protesters disrupted the peace, and they were arrested a lot. We're going to watch a video next week that goes over a lot of things that we're going to talk about in this section. And one of the things they will show you and talk a lot about is this deal that Kennedy cut and how many people were still getting arrested once they got to Mississippi and what that looked like in the jails and why that, even though it wasn't fun, it still kind of worked in the Civil Rights Movement activists' favor. Freedom riders were able to compel the federal government to act. The Federal Transportation Commission issued an order mandating desegregation on interstate transportation. It also showed that violence would not deter them or cause them to take up violent forms of protest themselves. So, in the video from the Butler, you'll see them practicing getting harassed, getting called names, getting, hit, pushed, and all the things, and not reacting themselves, which, I don't know about you guys, but I don't think I could do it. All right. James Meredith was an Air Force veteran who sought to enroll at the all-white University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss, and won a federal court case with the help of the NAACP, which ordered the university to desegregate and therefore allow him to enroll. Civil rights activist Medgar Evers helped him do that. The Mississippi governor, Ross Barnett, was determined to prevent integration. We've kind of seen this story before, right, with Little Rock 9 and Orville Faubus saying you're not going to get in, and that was a public high school. This is a public university. So a standoff between the governor and the federal government ensues. The federal government wins. So September 30th, Meredith arrives on campus under the protection of federal marshals. That night, there was a riot of white protesters. They were trying just to scare Meredith away, battling with the marshals that were there to protect him. Kennedy addressed the nation as the rioting was taking place on national television, saying, Americans are free to disagree with the law, but they are not free to disobey it. In other words, you cannot like the law all you want, but that doesn't give you the right to have a riot, to disrupt, to cause violence. The rioting went on throughout the night, and by the time it ended, 160 people were injured and 2 men were killed. Unfazed by the rioting, Meredith enrolled as a student the next morning, went on to graduate from Ole Miss in 1963. He then later went on to get his law degree from Columbia University. And we'll talk about this later, but Medgar Evers was assassinated when he got home one day by members of the KKK. Shot him from across the street as he was getting out of his car 3 years after this. In the spring of 1963, King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference focused on Birmingham, Alabama for a major civil rights campaign. Birmingham had the reputation of being one of the most segregated cities in the South, something that Birmingham police were pretty proud of, to be honest with you. The campaign began nonviolently at first with protest marches and sit-ins, but city officials got a court order making demonstrations illegal. Now we know that violates First Amendment rights, but it's 1963, it's the Civil Rights Movement, and we're in Alabama. April 12, 1963, King himself decided to violate the order, join the protest, knowing it would lead to his arrest, and from his jail cell, he wrote a letter explaining why he and other African-American leaders were tired of waiting for reform. So this is a little A little excerpt from his letter. So, to the African American community, the word wait, or this wait, has almost always meant never. He's saying when we hear the word wait, we know it's just lip service. It's just to pacify us, to move on and sweep things under the rug, and we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to riot, but we're not going to just wait either. After King was released from jail, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference increased the frequency, so they were doing it more and more, of the demonstrations. Again, still nonviolent. Birmingham's Public Safety Commissioner, Bull Connor, would no longer tolerate the demonstrations and ordered fire hoses and police dogs to be used on the protesters. And the pictures on this slide here made its way across the country. It was on the news, in newspapers, but pictures like the one in the top right corner, that's a 17-year-old kid. That's how old you guys are. And the police, you can see one guy grabbing him by the shirt, and the other guy, has the dog, just letting this dog attack him. And he's a peaceful protester. He was sitting on a sidewalk, marching with the group, not doing anything really against the law, but it was against the law in Alabama. And then that bottom right picture, those are protesters sitting on a sidewalk, and they're being blasted with the fire hose, which, if you've ever been hit with, accidentally, hit yourself with, a power washer before, that doesn't feel good. So they were doing that on protesters as young as 4 and 5 years old. Civil rights demonstrations and protests were taking place all over the country by this time, not just in the South, which made Kennedy realize he had to take a more active role. And so June 11th, 1963, he gave a televised address calling civil rights a, quote, moral issue, and declaring that the nation had an obligation to fulfill its promise of giving all Americans equal rights and equal opportunities. So he sent to Congress a proposal for civil rights legislation. This is June of 1963. By November of this year, Kennedy will have been assassinated. To put pressure on Congress to pass the new civil rights bill, supporters made a plan for a massive demonstration in D.C. So they brought together the NAACP, SCLC, and the SNCC, as well as, so that's, NAACP, but the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which we talked about in the beginning of this slideshow, as well as labor unions and religious groups. The March on Washington took place in August of 1963. Organizers were hoping that they would get 100,000. They had more than 200,000 people show up. Despite the numbers, it was peaceful and it was festive, and celebrities and entertainers volunteered to perform for the crowds. The main place for the rally took place in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and this is where Martin Luther King Jr. gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which was the highlight of the March on Washington. And a lot of that, you may not know, a lot of that speech was very off the cuff. He did that, kind of impromptu and in the moment. He planned on saying some things, but this part of the speech where he goes into his "I Have a Dream," which I've got a video of it for you on Classroom. That was improv, a lot of that. September 15th, 1963, 3 weeks after the March on Washington, a bomb goes off in the 16th Street Baptist Church. This was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's headquarters. 4 young African-American girls were inside, and they were killed in the explosion, so 4 little kids. November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. We'll talk about this a little bit later. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson becomes the new president, sworn in on Air Force One. I'll kind of talk about that a little bit later, too, because he technically was the president as soon as Kennedy died, but we'll talk about that later. Johnson put his full support behind the Civil Rights Bill. saying to Congress, no eulogy, so like if you don't know what a eulogy is, speech you make about a person at their funeral, no eulogy would more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest passage of this civil rights bill which he fought so long for. Johnson had an unproven record on the issue of civil rights. He's a Democrat. His support of the bill was surprising to a lot because he was from Texas. But he supported it, and he got it passed. The bill faced strong opposition in Congress, mainly by Southern senators. They attempted to block the bill's passage by means of a filibuster. If you don't know what a filibuster is, which you should, because it's a vocab word, but if you don't remember what it is, this is purposely wasting time, and it's legal to do that. It's still legal to that. It's something they've tried to get rid of before. They did this for 80 days, and you can do it a lot of different ways. In government, I've seen people reading different things and just not ceding their time to speak. I've seen people, reading parts of the Constitution, just different things to waste time. I may put a video on to kind of show you what that would look. But anyway, the Civil Rights Bill was eventually passed. The Civil Rights Bill of 1964. It's a big one. It bans segregation in public accommodations, so it really did take the Brown versus Board decision that happened 10 years before that and really use that as precedent and expand on it. So bans segregation in any public accommodation. Gives the federal government the power to compel state and local schools to desegregate. We'll see how they do that later, how they actually compel the schools. Establish the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Gave the Justice Department the ability to prosecute individuals who violated people's civil rights and outlawed discrimination in employment on account of race, national origin, or sex. So this is going to be important, not just for African Americans, but for all minorities and for women. Alright, there's your questions. They go at the end of your note-taking guide. Make sure you answer those, and that is the end of section